So maybe 1 more minute, Grace? Welcome, everyone. We're just giving another minute for people to join. Yes, Amna, yes. Okay. We ready to roll?
We are ready.
Super. So good evening, everyone. So lovely to see you all. We are very excited about this program tonight. One of the goals of the Palestine-Israel Working Committee, which existed before this Gaza campaign, was to educate the public. And part of that is to provide information to the public, but also to counter the misinformation. And I think most of you would agree that the mainstream media gives us a lot of misinformation and disinformation. So that's why, and it's extremely important to us to challenge sort of the, quote, manufacturing of consent, if you're familiar with Chomsky's term. So that's why we wanted to have this program on the media and how the media covers, the Middle East, but particularly the conflict in Israel and Gaza. So I'd like to introduce our guest, and we are excited to have with us Adel Iskandar, and I'm going to share my screen so you can see a little bit about him. So as you probably saw, he's the Associate Professor of Global Communication at Simon Fraser University, and he's lucky enough to be in Vancouver in Canada, which we will all flee to if the election results next year are not promising. I included here some of the things books he's authored or co-authored because I found them particularly interesting. And particularly interesting for our topic tonight is this story about Al-Jazeera, which I think is fascinating. The story of the rise of the Al-Jazeera network, which many of us turn to when we want to know what's really going on, right? And I think, and I just wanted to show this. Pat thought we should share the information about this film, which how many of you have seen this film? The Occupation of the American Mind, which is about how the pro-Israel lobby uses their influence in the American media. So I just thought I'd show that. Okay, so I'm done with that. So I'm going to spotlight Adel. Okay, so welcome. We're delighted to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, Abby. It's a real delight to be with everyone. I'm sorry to keep you up at night. This is probably dinner time for some of you, so I really appreciate the time you're taking to join us today. But looking forward to our conversation.
Lovely, thank you. So to give people a bit of a context of where you're coming from, Adel, you have spoken about your childhood in Kuwait and how that led to your interest in the media. Could you just say a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. It's very strange to be talking about my childhood now as someone in my mid-40s. It feels very distant, but I would say that one of the things that helped me sort of understand that consent can be manufactured was at a fairly early age. At 13, my family and I were living in Kuwait when the Iraqi military under Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait for some time. Most of you will know of the ensuing war, the first Gulf War, which was meant to liberate Kuwait, but also precipitated a complete transformation of the geography of the region. But during that time, I recalled being sort of a young person watching TV and following the news at the time, and the news was taken over by the Iraqi government, and we were being told that Iraq was in fact liberating Kuwait from the monarchical government. And then there was this very strange conflicting relationship between the reality that we were witnessing and what was happening on the ground. but also what's being reported on BBC and Radio Monte Carlo and various other networks on the radio, like transnational radio. This is before the advent of satellite television. So again, it was a very surreal moment, and it wasn't until we became refugees and escaped, and a new life started that I began to really understand what propaganda is, and will continue to be, how to unpack it, why it's necessary to develop media literacy and knowledge of how media work, and to be able to sort of think independently. And so it's turned into essentially a vocation for me. So that early experience helped kind of mold and shape my interests and my later work in this area.
Lovely. Thank you for that. So let's turn our focus to October 7th. Can you talk about how the mainstream media framed the attacks on October 7th?
Well, I'm going to talk to you about your media system in the US. I am sorry to, I mean, not that there is substantial differences between Canada, where I'm situated today, and the US, but nevertheless, I think there are some particularities to the media landscape in the US. So as you all know, and I think this comes to no surprise for most of us here, but what happened on October 7th, the tragic, brutal attacks by Hamas against Israelis, that day became immediately iconic and historic and landmark for Israelis, because Israelis had grown accustomed to a real sort of securitized way of life. The Israeli military and security apparatus and establishment pride themselves in the ability to secure and to protect the populace writ large. And of course, there's the militarization of Israeli society in the sense that everyone is a minder when it comes to these types of things. So for these attacks to happen, and the absolutely massive loss of life on the part of Israelis, meant that this was going to be a transformative moment of rapture for Israeli society. Now, it is understandable that the Israeli media immediately sort of whip that into a narrative that is anchored and built on the intent to enact revenge, to vindicate the state's treatment of Gazans, and Palestinians, whether it's through occupation, apartheid, or siege. But what came as a surprise to many was the how incredibly easy it was to transpose that narrative from the Israeli media environment and landscape to the US media landscape and environment, where everything was borrowed whole cloth, and it was turned into almost like a US war against Palestinians, not an Israeli war against Palestinians. Yeah. The synergy, continuity, and real sort of congruence between the Israeli political class and system and the US political class and system was really remarkable to watch, which meant that any context, any equivocation, any attempt to historicize the conflict were immediately seen as a way to either excuse Hamas's attacks and killings, or to outright support Hamas and their ideological position on Israel or on Jewish life or anything of the sort. So that became the modus operandi for the US media. And to work our way from that to a point where we begin to recognize the complexities of the conflict, the history of the conflict, and then of course what has ensued, which is essentially an all-out war against Palestinian life, not just Hamas. That has taken a significant amount of unpacking, historicization, and criticism of the media and media's conduct. Now, in terms of the actual conduct of the US media, as many of you will now realize, history began and ended on October 7th. When I say that, I mean that nothing happened preceding October 7th that could explain, I'm not saying justify, but could explain what precipitated on October 7th. But equally, nothing that has happened since October 7th, by way of the conduct of, the Israeli military or the political class in Israel, that is in any way more worthy of attention than October 7th. So you'll see the how October 7th becomes a point of reference and a point of inflection for any and all press coverage of what's happening in Gaza. It won't take you long if you sift through any print article, any major news piece on television, on radio, on network, on even on public broadcasting. You will note the really critical inclusion of October 7th, sometimes more than once, to accentuate and clarify, and in some instances, to protect the news media from potential litigation, criticism, or accusations of either anti-Semitism or anti-Israeli sentiment or of bias and partisanship. Mm-hmm. This is essentially an unusual state of affairs for the media because we are accustomed to seeing our media, or at least I should say, we would like to see our media become somewhat even-handed in their approach. I mean, some of the basic mantra and principles and ideals and codes of ethics of journalism are anchored on the notion that every story has multiple sides. But when it comes to Israel, Palestine, when it comes to the current conflict that's unfolding, when it comes to, I'm going to go off on a limb and call it a genocide because I don't feel like that's a controversial statement anymore, especially with the ICJ's provisional measures. But we're accustomed to there being multiple sides. If the conflict is between Palestinians and Israelis, then we expect to hear from Palestinians as well as Israelis. If the conflict is between the Israeli military and Hamas, then we expect to hear from the other side. For those of us who were around, during 9/11 and recall that period quite distinctly, you will be, you can remind the kind of the younger generation that even back then, Osama bin Laden, who was the most sought after kind of, quote unquote terrorist in the world, and was presiding over an absolutely brutal militia in the form of Al-Qaeda, they had their airtime. Their video messages were being aired and translated and subtitled and dubbed on U.S. networks. I'm not suggesting that Hamas should have their time in the limelight, but what I am saying is that Palestinians are human beings, and even Palestinian human beings don't get airtime. Any basic analysis of number of sources, number of individuals, humans, spokespersons on network or cable television, on radio, on podcasts, on every platform, including in print press, some of the first drafts of history in the form of our legacy print journalism, number of Palestinian voices is absolutely laughable. It really is. I mean, I bet most of us can name one or two. I mean, of course, we're in a little bit of a self-selecting group, so there might be a little bit of a bias in that respect. But for the average viewer, they're more likely to be able to recall or identify a celebrity who speaks and advocates on behalf of Israel, rather than a celebrity or notable spokesperson or a commentator who speaks on behalf of or supports or is in solidarity with Palestinians. So in essence, Palestinian voices are not only crowded out, they are left out. And that's a very, very distinct and very categorical decision. In addition to that, the coverage of the October 7th period and what followed that was the very clear and distinct discrepancy in the humanization of one community at the expense of another. We saw, of course, and understandably, any loss of life on the part of Israelis, Palestinians, Jews, Muslims, Christians, Taoists, Buddhists. I mean, human beings are human beings. And so, but the stories coming out of Israel in the aftermath of the attack of October 7th clearly humanized, the tremendous loss of life, families, hostages, their connections to their respective communities, their dreams, their aspirations, their losses, how they're putting their lives together, how they're piecing their lives together, their connections to US communities, all of this was unpacked with a tremendous amount of empathy and compassion, all of which is absolutely worthy and justified. But what we saw since then is the complete opposite when it comes to Palestinians. We're talking about somewhere between 27 and 30,000 Palestinians killed, and the vast majority of whom happen to be women and children, and the displacement of almost 2 million people. And 2/3 of a 2.3 million person population holed up in an extremely small space in the form of Rafah. I mean, it is really absolutely shocking that to this day we hardly hear a single story in the mainstream media about Palestinians. If one or two stories break through, through the cracks, or when there's an opportunity to tell a story, that's few and far between, and it of course does not represent the scale and the disproportionality of the loss of life. So we have an active and consistent and persistent dehumanization of Palestinians, the assumption that all Palestinians are Hamas, and that anyone who's calling for a ceasefire or protesting or supporting justice for Palestinians are themselves also sympathetic of Hamas or ideologically aligned with Hamas. Of course, very, very preposterous accusations, but nevertheless, that is the status quo and the standard practice for most US mainstream media, with very few exceptions.
Right. So you've explained in many ways how the media privileges the Israeli narrative through all of the reasons that you've just said. Can you explain why the media tends to parrot the Israeli narrative?
Well, I think it's quite simple. The first is the systematic demonization of Palestinians. I think that goes without saying, that when there is a perceived synergy and almost like overlap between Palestinianness and radical Islamist Hamas ideology, the assumption is that everybody is one and the same. The other thing too is the active erasure of Palestinianness. The assumption is that if you talk about Palestinians, if you talk about Palestine as even as a perceived place, that in and of itself is a negation of Israeli existence. It's a negation of Jewish presence in the land, which of course nothing could be further from the truth. Even the peace treaties and the peace accords and peace negotiations are anchored on the idea of a potential Palestinian state. But we've come so far from that, the assumption that Palestinians, A, are human beings, or B, that they deserve liberty or freedom or, pursuit of happiness, God forbid, or that they deserve equal rights, that it's very difficult for Palestinians to be represented in the media. Now, what I described about the media sort of principles on, representing one story and its opposite, or two sides of a story, well, if there's the active demonization of the Palestinian narrative, or the assumption that this is a war between Israel and Hamas and not Palestinians, and Hamas is a terrorist organization that cannot be negotiated with and should not be listened to and therefore should not be represented, that means there is no other narrative to be told. The only narrative that needs to or deserves repetition, advocacy, and representation is the Israeli one. And because the Israeli narrative is anchored largely on Israeli political class, the Israeli Defense Forces, and staunch Zionist positions, we see a completely one-sided and shifted spectrum, in fact. Like even those Jewish communities and Israelis who are, critical, for example, of Israel's military conduct or its political establishment, those individuals are also crowded out from those circles. So it is actually a very, very committed perspective, dedicated and committed to the right wing of the political spectrum, even within the Israeli political class.
So I appreciate your answer in describing these different factors. I was surprised because I didn't hear you mention anti-Semitism as a reason for the parroting.
Well, yeah, but I'm glad you mentioned that, because anti-Semitism has become sort of the real, be all and end all it is actually the singular most powerful instrument that is utilized and weaponized to silence any and all critics of Israel.
Right.
The perception that all Israelis are Zionists and all Jews are Zionists and all Israelis are, and that Semitism only exists among Jewish communities, or that there is a deep connection between Palestinian liberation and the Holocaust. There's so many conflations built into each other, to the extent that anti-Semitism no longer means what it actually means. In a very fundamental way, we all know what anti-Semitism means because we see it and we believe it and we understand it. But unfortunately, what's happened now is that anti-Semitism has been rendered a critique of a government and a government's conduct. And right now, this is, if it's hurting anyone, it is actually hurting Jewish communities who are unable to actually call out real anti-Semitism for what it is. And so, and it's also become weaponized in such a way that it is targeting Jewish communities of conscience for standing up. I mean, I cannot tell you how emotional I get when I watch Jewish communities, stand up in solidarity and support for Palestinian rights and freedoms. But a lot of those folks have been dealing with that same flag. So anti-Semitism, unfortunately, has been diluted to such an extent that I don't know if it really resonates the way it should, and whether it can be used in such a way to really target the communities, or I should say the groups, the individuals, and the political ideologies that are committed to anti-Semitism. Instead, it's targeting, students for justice, in Palestine and anywhere else. It's targeting human rights organizations, including Israeli human rights organizations. It's targeting international intergovernmental agencies. I mean, I've even heard criticism of families of Israeli hostages being called anti-Semitic for their criticism of Israel's conduct. I mean, all this to say that this has become a really problematic notion. Nevertheless, there are many who are standing up and saying, you know what, anti-Semitism is a real thing.
Yeah.
We need to characterize it, we need to identify it, and we cannot conflate it. Its conflation is exactly what renders it moot.
Yes.
So in the case of the media organizations, of course, being what they are, they're private, corporations as far as U.S. Institutions are concerned, and they are deeply worried about their bottom line, their profit, and their reputations. And any accusation of anti-Semitism, of racism, of bigotry, of warmongering are things that they are quite sensitive about. And so they tend to react by overshooting, which is to say, Israeli communities and Jewish communities are untouchable. We can't go there. We can't level any criticism of any behavior on the part of anyone in this area, even if it's, the actions of a warmongering state, not a Jewish community.
So this connects directly to the conversation that some of us in this letter writing group have had with the editors of the Boston Globe. And I want to ask Judy Weiss, Grace, can you find Judy and invite her, unmute her?
I'm here.
There you are, Judy. So this is Judy Weiss. She's we have this letter writing group in MAPA. There's 50 or I don't know, 40 or 50 of us. And Judy was part of the team that went to meet with the editors of the Boston Globe. Judy, can you describe what you all did?
Sure. In January, we were invited by Nancy Barnes, who's the editor of the Boston Globe, to bring a group and to talk. We had reached out to her to say that we were concerned about the coverage that the Globe had been in the Globe when they're talking about anti-Semitism. So exactly what you were just talking about Adele, that we wanted to talk to them about how they use it, what data they use, and to specifically, we had 4 asks, and those were to reject the definition that is currently being pushed by kind of pro-Zionist groups and has been adopted by many countries and by the United States in part, which is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism known as IRA. And so we said, don't use that, because that specifically, just as you were saying, it includes examples of criticism of the state of Israel and Zionism as anti-Semitic acts. And we wanted them also to be very clear with readers when they use the term anti-Semitism and when they use data that's reported, especially from the ADL, because they are the main reporters of anti-Semitic activity. And they have, since October 7th, have actually very clearly started including pro-Palestinian rallies and basic, what we would call false accusations of anti-Semitism. And then we also asked them not to exceptionalize anti-Semitism, and this also goes to what you were just saying, because the bigotry and hatred in this country has just gotten really out of control, and that actually what we need to do is to find the connections and to not exceptionalize anti-Semitism. And this has happened quite a bit in the globe since October 7th, when reporting on Jewish students, and speaking as a Jew, Jewish students feeling uncomfortable, etc. And then we also asked them to run a story exposing how the false accusations are being used as a weapon against free speech, and specifically for Palestinian rights and freedom. And soon after we met with them, they actually did run a story that was connected to Harvard, but they talked about the IRA definition and the problems with it. Not as much as we would have liked, but we felt that that was a success.
Super, Judy. Thank you so much. All right. So we're going to go back to Adel, and I want to close our interview because I want to leave room for the audience to ask you questions. And I don't know if you can give a short answer to this one. So I'm going to choose this one here. So what is the role of social media in changing the way people consume the news and the way they make sense of the conflict?
Well, so thank you for asking that question, Abby, and thank you, Judy, for reporting that. I'm deeply moved by this effort, and I wanted to really quickly acknowledge the incredible work that went into drafting those letters. It's really a labor of justice, and it's not easy to do this, especially to bring these issues forward to editors-in-chief. And they do listen, and this is about incremental change. So it may not be overnight, but over time there will be traction. So I just wanted to, kudos to everybody there. On that point, Abby, now I've lost my train of thoughts. I got so excited about the letter. So you were talking about social media. So the social media is obviously a double-edged sword, because there is certainly this is information that's being curated by persons in their homes. We no longer have sort of journalistic verification. Not that journalistic verification really matters anymore, given my early criticism. But today we have the incredible trajectory of real siloing of information. We've got algorithmic bias, which basically amounts to us seeing more of whatever it is that we want to see. The social media platforms have effectively pigeonholed us into our respective clusters, depending on our patterns of consumption. So there is that problem. But where there is hope in regards to social media versus mainstream media, we now have unfettered, unadulterated, and unfiltered access to information from far-flung places in areas that would otherwise be underreported about. When it comes to the current war, of course, we know the Israeli narrative. We know where it's coming from. We understand the manner in which it makes its way through the mainstream media. But the voices of Gazans normally would not be heard or
Right.
seen under any way. There's just no circumstance. There are no reporters on the ground, neither foreign correspondents or major broadcast networks. The satellite uplinks are few and far between. Their telecom towers have either been knocked out, and their their network services is almost always on blackout. So effectively, Gaza should be one of the most disconnected and most underserviced media environments in the world. However, in reality, on the social media, it is totally the opposite.
Yeah.
And I say that because of the remarkably enterprising efforts of what we would call citizen journalists, civic journalists, or just people who have turned into journalists. Individuals reporting on their lives, their struggles, their plight, their conditions, their circumstances, and then sharing them with whomever might be interested or whoever is following them. Some of the people who are doing this work have now become household names in the US because of the number of people who follow them. I think in the case of Mu'taz Zaiza, I think he's got more followers on Instagram than President Biden, which is, in and of itself is quite remarkable. But these are individuals who not only risk their lives, many of them have actually been killed. I would say that there are more, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, there are more journalists killed in Gaza than at any other conflict since the organization came into being.
Yes.
It's possibly deadlier than any other conflict in the 20th and 21st century thus far. So all this to say that the stories are only making their way through the social media because we are in control. We're in the driver's seat on those platforms to the extent that we can, despite the fact that many of those platforms are either shadow banning people or trying to restrict access to certain stories. And there is sort of a hierarchy of narratives within them. But nevertheless, we are the ones choosing to follow, to unfollow, to share, to not share, to turn something into a story. That degree of control, back in the day when YouTube first started, their slogan was called broadcast yourself, right? Today, people are broadcasting themselves.
Yes.
And when people on the front, who have a front row or a front seat in history, who are making history, or who are having history be made to them or on them, people who are being killed or slaughtered or genocide or attacked or bombarded or starved, when they share their stories live, unfiltered, unedited, the impact is so significant. It really skips. We no longer really care about the role that editors, producers, and folks who are busy snipping away on materials. We're seeing it live in its natural form. And that's a game changer.
Yes, live and unmediated. There is no mediator. Yes.
Exactly.
So I found Motaz and Bisan and Hind Kaudry. So these people, wonderful. Okay, so Grace, can we open the chat? And then we need to let Amna, here you are. Amna, I'm going to add you to the spotlight. No, spotlight. There you are.
How do we ask questions?
So could you put your questions in the chat, please? And then Amna's going to select from those questions. We have about 20 minutes and we'll ask Adel to respond to the question. So I'm going to turn it over to Amna.
Thank you, Abby. And thank you for sharing your insights and perspective with us this evening, Adel. It was really insightful. And particularly, I think, Abby, your last question in regards to the impact of social media, that was something I was really wanting to hear from you about, because I think for the first time in any conflict, even when you were talking about 9/11, for example, we did not have that. And I think a lot of our younger people are definitely consuming that media versus print or traditional. So I'm just going to monitor the chat and pick out some questions from the audience for you. And
So Stephen has a question.
yes, so Stephen wants to know if demonization of Palestinians is one, but not the only reason for US media parroting of Israeli media. There are economic, colonial, and military reasons for US news sources to parrot Israel. And so, what your comments on that front be, I guess?
I mean, I think Stephen nailed it. The relationship between the U.S. and Israel is certainly not just limited to sort of a kind of a solidaristic, we see eye to eye on things. It's a military, industrial, colonial relationship, and one that serves the interests of both countries in a substantial way. To challenge Israel's primacy in the region and to challenge its ambitions on versus the Palestinians is to negate some of the foundational and fundamental aspects of the settler colonial project that is the United States. I mean, I meant to say this in the beginning of my talk, but I'm joining you here from the unceded and stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples in the Coast Salish areas of the Pacific Northwest of Canada. But we have come to understand the depth of colonial erasure on this continent. And so to understand that is to understand also the intrinsic relationship that exists between settler colonialism here and settler colonialism in Palestine, Israel. So this is definitely part of the discourse. And arguably, I would say, challenging that would be a colossal break with all of those different things. Like if the US were to stop aiding the Israel militarily, economically, culturally, and in terms of like continuing this colonial project, what would it do? How would it justify it? How would it justify its own sense of selfhood? So I think this is a really, really, I mean, in a way you've answered the question, but I just wanted to affirm your query. Thank you, Stephen.
And I guess Jeff would like to know, sort of the role of writing letters to religious leaders or trying to get more of a religious slant, perhaps. Would that help us, I guess, win the media battle? Or, would they be more willing to take that side of the cause on if there was more of a religious slant to it?
Absolutely. I'm not going to be equivocal about this at all, but any and all Jewish communities and individuals, especially persons of faith and theology. I personally am a student of many a Jewish prophetic liberation theologist, and to me, the role that rabbis for peace play to significantly change the landscape of this conflict cannot be overstated. And I can name a long list of rabbis who've really stood up in this critical juncture in human history and really said, never again for anyone in a fundamental way. But I think the ranks of those communities and those figureheads need to increase, and they need to be more vocal. And of course, if they're inside Israel, then that also is substantial. Now, that doesn't make them immune from criticism, condemnation, and attacks on the grounds of anti-Semitism. But nevertheless, like Birmingham, like so many other moments in collective history, we have to be able to come together in solidarity. And no community is more vital today than Jewish communities around the world standing up and saying, I'm sorry, Israel's actions do not represent us. This is not Judaism. This is not our Jewishness. This is not our Jewish tradition. These people do not speak for us. So yes, I absolutely affirm that, Jeffrey.
Yep, that I agree with that. I'm not exactly sure what Louise is asking, but I'm just going to give my interpretation of her question to you. So she's asking what effort is made to reach the BBC or other large media outlets. And I'm assuming this is in response to your comment about Palestinian voices either being silenced or erased. But if she has a different angle, I'm sure she'll put it into the chat.
So just to let you know, the large just Louise, I'm just looking at your question now. So what effort is made to reach? Okay, so I think there is a lot of effort to try and reach large mainstream media organizations. I want you to know that for every horrible report on Palestinian loss of life from any of the mainstream news organizations, there is an equal response on the part of viewers who are deeply upset and unsettled by it. News organizations have received more letters of criticism and condemnation from angry publics than any other time in history. In fact, even within those news organizations, there are internal mutinies happening, whether it's the LA Times or BBC or CNN. In fact, The Guardian ran a huge article a couple of days ago about the number of staff members at CNN basically saying that they've tried their best to push their editors and their senior producers to change the way the conflict is covered, but to no avail. And their level of frustration amounts to, or indicates that, and their inability to actualize change in the organization means that that CNN has effectively abandoned its journalistic principles. So this pushback against the coverage is happening from outside and happening from inside the news organization. Nevertheless, and even though there are cracks in the system in the sense that from time to time we will see those stories, they're starting to proliferate very sluggishly and very slowly and very infrequently, but we're starting to see them. But it is nevertheless a function of that pressure. The work that Judy described, I mean, this is exactly the kind of work that needs to be done. News organizations need to be taken to task. And I cannot tell you how incredibly impactful it is for these news organizations to have Jewish people come up to them and tell them, you know what? By criticizing Israel, you are not anti-Semitic. I, as a Jew, hereby declare that criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic. In fact, all you have to do is look at Haaretz's coverage and Israeli publication to see that there is more criticism of Israel in an Israeli newspaper than there is in all US media combined. You know? So I think this type of pressure needs to continue existing, but there also needs to be empowerment of news organizations when they do a good job. So, for example, if BBC were to have a detailed sort of survey of the destruction, which of course they did, survey of the destruction of Gaza's, northern Gaza and central Gaza and Gaza City, with satellite images and detailed maps and things of that sort. This is the kind of stuff that you want to share because they monitor the frequency with which information is circulated. When they see that, it's an affirmation that the work that they've done is worthwhile and is appreciated by audiences. The same way that we write letters of criticism, we can write letters of acknowledgement. Say, you know what? We liked what you did here, here, and here. You failed here, or you did a horrible job covering this story, but you've succeeded here. And that really matters. So I just wanted to say, it's not just, we can't just chase them around with sticks. We can't just subject them to flack. We have to fundamentally acknowledge when work is done well.
Can I just say, Adel, that we are huge fans of Gideon Levy, who writes for Haaretz, and the things that he says, he pulls no punches.
He's amazing. A true legend.
Yeah.
As Amira Haas, for example.
Oh, yes, for sure.
Amira Haas, definitely. Yeah. Yep. And Ernie has a question, I think, that relates to the Ben Gurion Canal. So I'll just what he's asking. He wants to know if it's because they want to clear out a path for a canal from the Aqaba McDonald's on the north end of the Gulf of Aqaba all the way south, Dead Sea, and overpass Beer Sheva to Zaytun and Gaza.
That is the Ben Gurion Canal.
Right, and I believe that's what he's referencing there. It has been, I think, a part of, at least on social media, it has been brought up a whole lot. And when Netanyahu held up the map of the new Middle East, where the Palestinian territories had been completely wiped out, and then he took that red marker and drew that line through for the new trade routes, and so I guess it's been rattling around. Do you have a sense of the sort of validity of those claims?
I'm going to be honest with you, and I'm sorry to disappoint you, Ernie, but I'm neither a political scientist nor it's above my pay grade. Not that I have a pay grade to kind of speak to this. I will say that some of the, if one were to describe it as speculative, that would be an understatement. I think there is certainly a plan of this sort that was being hatched. The extent to which and the details of which may be a little bit, just a lot of these details are unclear. I mean, one could catch little smatterings of it in the different kind of dispersed news media coverage in different places. Like some of the Israeli press will cover something, some of the Saudi, I'm not going to call it independent because no independent press, but there's like discussions of it happening in different places. But I will say that a lot of it is also posturing on the part of Israel. Israel was very much celebrating and parading its efforts at normalization with a lot of the neighbors in the region. And I will say that even though the Saudis appear to be enthusiastic, a lot of this was happening and being shepherded by the US government. And it was in the interest of Israel to really kind of showcase the incredible modernization projects that will unfold as a result. So I think this is certainly part of that, but I would say that there's probably more competition than there is cooperation in this field, but it's not being articulated in that manner. Now, at this particular juncture in time, I don't know if any of these plans are still on the table, because even if Saudi Arabia, which of course Saudi Arabia never ceases to surprise as far as like its complicity with any and all human rights violations everywhere. But nevertheless, if it would surprise me if Saudi Arabia is prepared, at least in the medium term, to work closely with the current Israeli government in with its current actions, because this is really like what's happening right now is not only anathema for progressive Arabs and Muslims, it is anathema for anyone really in the world. So it's going to be very difficult to rehabilitate Israel back to where we were pre-October 7th, at least in the immediate future. But nevertheless, I trust that some of those plans are on hold. They're on a back burner. They may resurface again in the future, but there will need to be a significant change in the political landscape for these ideas to come back to life. But again, don't take my word for it. I'm neither a political scientist nor am I well versed in this matter.
There has been some reporting about licenses being granted for offshore drilling for the Gaza marine field, the oil fields. So, there might be.
Which was going to happen anyway. I mean,
Israel. Right. So there's stuff percolating. It's hard to really make sense. And then Valentina has a question that actually I have been also wondering about regarding the trend in the reporting, right? So as time has passed, 4 months into the aggression that has been ongoing, do you see that there is any sort of a shift that is happening in the liberal media, to actually start presenting a more balanced or fair analysis of the situation? Or, as she puts it, is it similar to Biden's and likely insincere critique that Israel's assault is over the top?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question, Valentina. I don't think it's equivalent to an elected head of state using their political platform to protect themselves and to speak out of two sides of their mouth. I think that is that's a different kind of political posturing. I think what is happening in the media is twofold. When it comes to public broadcasting, and actually it's not twofold. It is the same fundamental thing that is causing the transformation. but it's happening both in the public media and the private media. When it comes to the private media, they are fundamentally beholden to advertisers, right? And advertising revenue is the source of profit for most private news networks, and advertisers only care about viewership, right? So if your ratings are dropping because people are not watching it, or people are concerned and worried or upset or angry with your programming, and they're letting their opinions be aired out against you, including criticism on social media. Every time you run a story, people are lambasting you in the comments. That is not good for advertisers. And I know we often don't think about it this way. We're always thinking in terms of the ideological, but think about the business offices inside those news organizations. They're thinking to themselves, we are really screwing up this story. Even if we're told that this is the way we need to report it, we have audiences, we have advertisers, we need to deal with that. And so the shift in the narrative is happening because when a story is covered that focuses or foregrounds or humanizes Palestinians, and it reverberates and travels and circulates widely, that's good news for advertisers. You can tell advertisers that this article, this news piece, this story was picked up this many times. You got to remember, this is all about analytics, right? So for private media, that's how it works. For public media, well, they're public broadcasters. Where is the public? The most important thing for public broadcasting is public opinion polling. And as we have seen in the last, couple of months, we're starting to witness a shift in people's perception of this conflict. It may seem incremental, it may seem small, but even a single point or 2 percentage point differences is substantial, especially with the demographic that these broadcasters care about significantly. If you are between the ages of 18 and 35, you are in prime, this is the age group that every advertiser, every public media, every private media enterprise wants to tap into. So really, this is a very self-serving reason rather than, justice for Palestinians or saving, poor Palestinians. Of course, there are folks inside those news organizations who are deeply moved, hurt, and committed to covering these stories well. But whether or not a story makes it depends largely on editorial policy. And editorial policy is also dictated by the business offices and the public opinion polling. So those are the things that I would draw your attention. So I do think they're genuine. I think they're legitimate, but they are self-serving institutionally. And in some instances, it may also be a way to preempt what is coming on the horizon as the ICJ proceedings continue over the next couple of years, as more cases come to various courts, whether it's in the United States or internationally. Israel is going to be in the limelight and will be criticized, and there will be many a tribunal to discuss what's happening in Gaza. Where do these media organizations want to be in relation to history? How will they revise their narrative moving forward? We've seen that with the Iraq War. We've seen that the war in Afghanistan. We've seen it in so many other cases where, like, okay, what happens to false pretenses? What happens to false intelligence? What happens to false reporting? What happens to overzealous, overly jingoistic, patriotic reporting that, is vacuous and empty? So news organizations do not want to be caught in this web again. And so a lot of it is that as well. So I wouldn't say it's vacuous, vapid, or empty, but in many instances, it can be self-serving institutionally.
Amna, hold on a second. We need to pause for a minute. So
Sure.
Adel, we have an action that we want to give people because I'm noticing the time. It's almost 8 o'clock. Would you be willing to stay a few minutes beyond 8 o'clock to answer some questions? Oh, thank you so much. So folks, we want to put this action, I'm putting it in the chat window. We would like all of you to take this action, which is, the point is no military aid to Israel while it's violating human rights. You probably all know that the Senate passed yesterday, they passed a 95 billion emergency bill to Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan. And this is after they had voted to condition aid on to make sure that the countries weren't violating human rights abuses. And then they went ahead and passed this bill. We need a ceasefire. We need a permanent ceasefire, and we need no military aid to Israel. So if you would all click on that link, and put in your names and sign up for that action, that would be great. Cole, is there anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think you said it.
Okay.
Sorry, Abby, if I can quickly add, I sent in an action that was updated based on the events that happened with the Senate. So the one that I sent has been updated regarding the Senate vote on the aid package.
Thank you so much, Grace. So it turns out if you all would click on the link that Grace sent and then put in your name. And then after that, we'll continue with some of the questions. Let's just give them another minute.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that you can click on a.
You can click on that link, Jeffrey. Grace, could you go back and mute people?
Oh, you can also save the chat.
Yes, no, those are the ones that I mentioned. That
Yeah,
I follow.
I didn't see you had written them already, Abby.
I didn't write them. I mentioned.
Oh,
I
okay.
said to
Oh,
Adel, I
yes,
said those are the
yes.
ones.
Yes. And I guess if people know of others, I know there's Plastia is another one.
Yeah, she's excellent also. Yeah.
Yes.
So,
Okay, so are we good to?
well, yeah. So folks, you know, Adel has offered to stay and answer some of your questions. So Amna, why don't you go ahead? So we hope that you'll stay. Louise, could you put your question in chat so Amna can take them from there? Go ahead, Amna.
Okay, so the next couple of questions kind of Adel are related to you know, the issue, the conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And Edward and Amy have sort of interrelated questions. Amy asks, we read often that the majority of Israelis support Israel's war on Gaza. I find this hard to believe. Can you comment? And Edward, in a somewhat related question, is saying, is not Israel's raison based on anti-Semitism? And one reason it's hyped by Israel supporters so much, one reason anti-Zionism are equated by Israeli supporters. So I guess, you know, that kind of speaks, perhaps the question speaks to whether, in fact, Israeli general public is really as much in support, full-fledged support of the war ongoing against Gaza right now, and how much of that perhaps is driven by perhaps the fear that, you know, their very existence as an ethno-state is perhaps at risk, right? You're muted, Adel. Hang on one second.
Sorry about that. No,
Okay,
these are really good questions. I will say, I'll speak to the question about Israeli public opinion and people's convictions and motivations there. The unfortunate reality is that right now, the vast majority of the Israeli population does support the Israeli government's actions in Gaza. We can talk ad nauseum about how we got to this point. I mean, there are far more well-versed persons on this than I am. Everyone from like Ilan Pape to Avi Shlaim, even like, you know, Daniel Levy, like so many people speak to this very, very succinctly. But I will say, and this is only a continuation of what they've shared elsewhere, but in a very fundamental way, in the last 20 to 30 years, I would say that at the very least, since Ariel Sharon was prime minister, the Israeli state has been able to essentially manufacture a real sort of right-wing, jingoistic, you know, essentially almost kind of like fascist nationalism that perceives, with tremendous zealotry, that perceives Palestinians as non-humans or subhumans, that they are not only an inconvenience and a nuisance, but a real obstacle to a prophetic future that allows Israel to become a unified, contiguous Jewish homeland that is exclusive and wholly self-representative. And I think that in and of itself is a real problem. So October 7th and the attacks by Hamas fit perfectly into this narrative in such a way so as to confirm the not only the animosities but the demonizations of Palestinians everywhere. I mean, you will see that the number and the scale of attacks against Palestinians in the West Bank, where Hamas is kind of inoperative essentially, have skyrocketed in the last few months, and the state's escalation of attacks against Palestinians there has also escalated. I mean, it is happening everywhere across Palestine, Israel. Even within Israel, 1948 Palestinians, or what some might call Israeli Arabs, who constitute 20% of the population, they too feel immensely embattled in Israel during these days. So yes, we are actually in a sort of a post 9/11 moment where everyone is quote unquote supporting the troops. We've heard that so many times. Anytime a conflict happens, like, support the troops and then think first. Suspend judgment, suspend intellectual kind of thinking, suspend your logic and rationality, and accept that we are currently at war. And if you don't support the troops, then you are a traitor. And that's the logic of the state at this particular juncture. But I would say that it's not just limited to this conflict. This is a machine that has been well-oiled and it's self-reproductive. I mean, I've seen an incredible documentary, I don't know if those of you have seen it or not, but Israelism by Aaron Axelman.
Excellent.
Tremendous film. It kind of explains the transformation of Jewish communities into ardent Zionists who support Israel and erases Palestinianness. I would say Ariel Sharon takes primary credit for instigating this because of the apartheid wall. The apartheid wall has had irreparable damage. It's irreparably damaged the potentiality for coexistence between Palestinians and Israelis because it effectively severed them from one another. There isn't even contact between them. The limited contact between Israelis and Palestinians, even in the West Bank, where the population of Palestinians is quite sizable, happens at the end of a gun barrel, where Israelis are serving their military service in these communities. And so there is no circumstance where Palestinians aren't perceived as a potential threat. And so the severing of those relationships, the complete sort of dichotomization of Palestine, Israel, and not into two contiguous states, but rather into this dystopic, out of this world apartheid, regime is really a function, or I should say it explains where we are today. I mean, one should not be surprised that when Israelis are posting on Twitter, Israeli soldiers to be precise, and civilians as well, sharing videos on TikTok and Instagram, parading and celebrating the death and destruction and the dehumanization of Palestinians, that is just a tip of the iceberg, right? It is really, really, really diabolical. And I think for those of you who want to understand this more, you can listen to a lot of the lectures and presentations given by Gabor Mate, who himself is a Holocaust survivor and a former Zionist Jewish trauma therapist, who talks about how collective trauma in the aftermath of the Holocaust has been repurposed and turned into an ethno-nationalist ideology. So again, all this to say, it is unfortunate that this is where we're at, and that the younger generation of Israelis are being bred into this, right? I can only imagine what October 7th will do to help re-entrench a narrative of, self-victimization and self-defense and existential threat and desire to exterminate the other. But I'm deeply concerned. I'm really deeply concerned that the only way to break this is to have visionaries and leadership from within Israel to take the mantle and push for an alternative political kind of vision. But right now, it doesn't bid well. The other question, I'm sorry, like that was very long-winded, but I felt like I needed to vent. The other question I've sort of dropped. I'm sorry, it was related to anti-Semitism as well.
Well,
But
as she looks back to that, Amna, can we do one question? Louise is in the Gaza campaign, and I'd like us to be able to pose her question.
Yes, I'm actually searching for her question. I'm not seeing it.
I'm going to read it.
So
I have
if
it
you,
here.
okay.
Adel, she's asking, what about identification with the aggressor? I'm not sure what that means. Do you know what it means?
is it just that
I was looking for a different part, maybe that we missed perhaps to that question.
Louise, what does that mean? What about the identification with the aggressor?
Well, it goes along with what we were just talking about, I think. The identification with the aggressor is something that a psychologist came up with, I think it was a while ago, but what it means is that when people have been traumatized and been like in the Holocaust, that sometimes what happens is that when they're dealing with other people that they see as vulnerable, that they become aggressive towards the vulnerable. They become acting like Nazis towards the people that they turn it around, and I was just wondering if there's any kind of self-awareness of that in Israel, because I mean it seems sort of understandable, but on the other hand, what's ever going to stop all this if some people are horrible to some people and then those people turn around and are horrible to somebody else? Do you understand what I mean?
I do understand what you mean. Thank you, Louise.
Oh, good.
I honestly can't speak to this because there are a lot of things that I'm not, and one of them is a psychologist. But I mean, I do recognize what you're describing, and often it's called the Stockholm syndrome. But the idea of sort of sympathizing with one's oppressor or one's captor, and I would say that I can't speak to that as sort of a generalized sociological phenomenon that is collectively experienced by a community in an expansive way, like a national populace. But I will say that what might have more primacy in this case would probably be the traumas of the Holocaust and the manner in which the traumas of the Holocaust have been carried over one generation after the next. And I think, and it's understandable because we see that on the Palestinian side as well, with the memory of the Nakba and dispossession and displacement and longing for home and estrangement. And so those, when you think about the incredible sort of cumulative impact of revisiting and revising and narrativizing and listening to the testimonies and the stories over and over again, it can give the impression that you are continuing to live the trauma, not just in memory, but in practice. In the sense that when October 7th happens, of course, I'm excluding the state and the Israeli state from that, because the Israeli state is a pragmatic, empirical, positivist entity that does things for its own self-interest. But I mean, in terms of the public, Israeli public, for many people, watching October 7th must have resonated in the long sort of narration of the history of Jewish kind of dispossession and dehumanization, and so it precipitates this view of existential threat. And when one is in a state of existential threat, then it sometimes produces the kind of paranoid desire to destroy one's adversary or one's nemesis purely out of self-preservation. But again, I'm venturing into territory that I can't speak for, but you, at least I'm interpreting this at the very least from the way in which the news media reproduces these discourses, because you see them, right? You see that in the Israeli press, the view that October 7th is a continuation of the Holocaust, not just the most violent day since the Holocaust, but it is the same thing. So equating European anti-Semitism and Nazism and fascism and what it's done to Jewish communities in Europe and transposing it onto a completely different geographic political landscape and seeing those two in continuity and bringing the younger generation into that old trauma so that they begin to see what the Holocaust looks like in real life, in real time. So that is, to me, I'm witnessing that and I'm watching it unfold in a mediatized way. But I can't speak for, psychology and how it impacts people. But at the very least, what you're describing is a thing. Whether or not it makes them empathize with the captors or with aggressors and replicate the abuse of, that's another dimension that I can't speak to. But as far as discourses are concerned, it's about survival, and Israel feels existential threat from everything and anything, especially the mere existence of Palestinians, and therefore it necessitates this type of brutal action, unfortunately.
Yeah. I'm gonna hold on 1 second. So I want to read what Judy posted here because Judy spoke to us about what they did with the Boston Globe. So I'd like to highlight what she's saying here, which is we're following up on our meeting by analyzing Globe reporting since our meeting to point out examples of the issues that we raised with them, but also to shine a light on examples of what we would like to see from them. So like the article on the IRA definition. That's great, Judy. Thank you. Folks, we're running out of time. So Amna, how about one last question? And you want to do Ashwin's question?
Sure, we can.
Please.
I'm just gonna have to scroll back up there.
Please.
Do you want me to do it? I got it here.
Do you have it? I got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So the last question
Why
is,
don't you just read it? Yeah.
how does the diplomats/agencies involved in mainstream communications/negotiations from the US or Israel or Middle Eastern countries completely deny the genocide narrative to such an extent that is disturbing and plain insulting to all the journalists trying to broadcast the truth?
So this is a critique of the first part.
I guess the agencies themselves that are involved in the mainstream sort of communications.
I mean, like in terms of agency, as in news agencies, as opposed to.
Yeah, I'm assuming that's what it is, though it says diplomats in front of that. I'm not sure whether that means that why the diplomats are not coming forth more.
Well, I mean, honestly, in the realm of international relations and diplomatic, relations between countries, there's a tendency for those communities to privilege interests over values, and that's kind of the unfortunate thing about international politics, which is why we see a lot of politicians and the diplomatic corps kind of like skirting around the issues, exercising excess caution when it comes to describing the violations in various ways, trying not to anger countries that they are dependent on for, foreign aid or arms or various kind of supplies or, trade agreements. There's just so many layers to these diplomatic relations that, in a very functional way, values go out the door. And then, of course, don't get me wrong, most countries in the region, in the Middle East, are themselves the violators of human rights, which is to say that the last thing that they want is to draw too much attention to their own human rights records. So they turn a blind eye to Israel's actions in the hope that nobody targets or tarnishes them. In addition to the fact that many of them do have trade agreements, even if they're not made public, with Israel, with the United States, and with allies of Israel. You got to follow as well the European trajectory on this, because Europe has been absolutely abhorrent on this, with a few exceptions like the Spanish, the Irish, and a few other, the Belgians. But by and large, the European countries, especially Germany, have been absolutely preposterous in that regard. And so for most countries, they're watching to see whether the tide turns and how the dust settles, if it settles at all, and based on that, make the necessary determinations about their next steps, which, as far as I'm concerned, is an abrogation of their responsibilities and a complete denial of the existence of international law. So it raises questions about the mere legitimacy of those governments and the political elite in those respective countries. When it comes to the if we were to apply that to the media, then the media themselves are also complicit. But at the very least, the media are beholden to viewers and audiences who can hold them to a court and hold them to a particular standard. They may be slow and sluggish in their responses, but eventually they have to be able to take responses from us. The governments that, on the contrary, if these are democratically elected governments, well, then people can shift and change based on electoral politics. We've seen, for example, here in Canada, we've seen how a very, very staunch Zionist and Nakba denialist BC Minister of Higher Education could be pushed into resigning for saying horrible things about
She was ridiculous.
She was ridiculous.
Completely ridiculous. I cannot believe that a minister of education would be making those statements.
For those who don't know what we're talking about, she came out and said that before 1948, Palestine, and she couldn't say the word Palestine because it's, and use that word, but that Israel before 1948 was just a crappy piece of land with nothing on it. It didn't have an economy. There was no agriculture. And that, anyway, that Zionists kind of built the country from scratch, but which is a strong and existing narrative. But for a minister of education to say that, higher education, it's quite important. But all this to say that pressure produces outcomes, because in countries where there's such a thing as a public, where such a thing as political participation and citizenry, then things can happen. We can change the levers if we try to. But in many parts of the world, that is not the case. So we should take advantage of those opportunities when presented to us. And we have to recognize that, I'm going to say this, and this is a burden of responsibility for everyone who's here on this call. But I want to tell you that the only public opinion that matters in the world today when it comes to the genocide against Palestinians in Gaza is US public opinion. Your thoughts, your reflections, your views, the views of those around you, your neighbors, your classmates, your coworkers, your kids, your parents, that is what matters the most. You are single-handedly capable of shifting not only the politics of Palestine, Israel, but of shifting global politics as a whole. And so with that responsibility, I wish you well, and I cheer you on across the border. But it is a hefty responsibility, and I appreciate the work that your organization is doing and bringing people together from across generations, backgrounds, histories, religions, ethnicities, backgrounds. That's very, very admirable, and I'm sure you've seen your numbers swell, because that is how everybody recognizes how critical this moment is. But I want to thank you for your efforts, and I want to thank you for allowing me to speak to you today.
Adel, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Adel. I just want to call out one comment here in the chat because I think it's so important. And Gidon Levy in Haaretz has said this many times, that Israelis are not seeing what's happening in Gaza. What they're seeing 27 on their TV screens are replays of interviews of the hostages and what's happening with the hostages and their families and so forth. And so, Abigail, thank you very much for that comment. I'm going to, Adel, if you would just hold on a second. I'm going to remove the spotlight so that you can see. How do I do that?
You did it.
Just removed my spotlight. Because I'd like you to see people thanking. So you all, could you please clap or in some way signify your appreciation to Adel for this wonderful webinar? Thank you, Adel, and thank you for staying a little later than we expected. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have
All
a
right,
good
night,
night,
everyone.
Have a good dinner, Adel.